and welcome to the Unhinged History Podcast, the podcast where two friends compulsively learn history and then come together and tell each other the stories we've only recently researched because our partners are tired of hearing them and tired of hearing us go, but wait, there's more. Did you know? Like, they're done with it. I'm host one.
You know what's,
Go ahead. No, interrupt.
I was just gonna say, you know what's worse is when they're not done and they keep feeding you information. Have you
Mm,
experienced that? Because that's my husband in a nutshell. Like, I just talked to you for 7 hours about this topic and you're hitting me with more. I don't have enough space in my notes for what you're telling me.
yeah, yeah. Or when you find something utterly fascinating and they look at you like, yeah, I thought everyone knew that.
Nothing makes me madder than that. Like, no, no, no. This is not new information. Like, this is new information for you. This is not old news. Like, be surprised, damn it. Clutch your pearls at least.
But anyhow, all that to say, I'm Theresa. And
I'm
that's,
Angie.
yeah, welcome.
Okay. Bye. That's it.
Yeah. And we're done here. That's a wrap, folks.
One for the box. Oh,
So,
I don't
yeah.
know who. So I don't know how you want to work it today. What do you want to do?
I mean, I'm looking at our notes, and you started us off last week with war elephants when I did
More
Sister Rosetta
elephants.
Tharp.
That's right.
So that means I'm going to go first.
I'm here
And
for you going first.
before I'm going to hit you with a forgotten episode, and I'm going to say what I'm covering, and you're going to say, "No, you did that. You've covered that, Teresa. We've been through this." I just want you to know this is the fight we're about to have. Okay?
So I'm pulling up the
You're pulling up the
notes.
spreadsheet. Um,
hmm
I am going to tell you about the time the Japanese bombed Brookings, Oregon during World War II.
That's a forgotten episode.
That's a forgotten episode.
Wild.
The ep
I
the story that got lost is the one that like has 2 million views on TikTok,
gotcha.
which is mind-blowing that we blew the audio for that.
Devastating.
These are things. But either way, for those of you who don't know this story or haven't seen the TikTok, or hell, maybe you just want the deep dive because you're thinking you limited it to under 3 minutes. Like there's got to be more to the story. And you're right, there's a lot more.
Facts.
My sources are the official website of Brookings, Oregon. The Oregon Public Broadcasting has a post about this. The State of Oregon website has a piece on this as well. And then before this, I was also reading a little bit from the U.S. Naval Institute. They have a piece written by uh, Nobuo Fujita, who is the one who bombed Brookings, Oregon. So here we go. It is 9 months after the attack of Pearl Harbor. It's on September 9th, 1942. We're 20 miles outside of Crescent City, California, in a really, really small town area of Oregon. And a Japanese submarine uses a catapult to launch a wheelless plane from its deck.
The image. I completely forgot about the catapult.
Yeah. I mean, and that was one of the craziest things. Like when I first launched the TikTok video, everyone was like, Submarines don't have planes." Like, and I'm like, okay, I mean, you're not wrong. Most don't, but
But here we are.
I mean, obviously it happened once. But this one did. There were a couple underwater aircraft carriers, as they were called, that the Japanese had. Um, and this is one of them. Now, piloting the plane is a man named Nobuo Fujita, he's fantasized, absolutely just daydreamed about dropping bombs over San Francisco, maybe LA. Like he is still a little salty about the bombing of Tokyo. And I will just pause here because one of the things, having lived in Japan in multiple areas for years and years, if you're on mainland, like the main island, and you're looking around and you see a street that is big enough for two cars to be driving simultaneously opposite directions, it is very likely that that road was completely leveled during World War II. And when they were rebuilding, they had the ability to make the roads large enough for vehicles.
I would have never thought about that. But
You
yeah,
know,
these
you
things.
you learn that um in kind of passing and hearing people talk. And then you go, oh. Um, but either way, so Fujita's a little salty that they bombed Tokyo. And the Japanese higher ups, they recognize exactly how guarded these major cities are. Lots of
Of US cities,
airports.
right?
Yes, US cities. And
Okay.
so the Japanese are like, it's a great idea. But we like keeping our planes intact because they're expensive and we have a limited amount in the submarine and we just don't want to lose them. Now,
What?
I know it's
Logic?
bizarre. And see, another thing that kind of got me is, and this is something about like the whole eye for an eye bit, because Fujita's upset about the attack on Tokyo, but the Americans are upset about the attack on Pearl Harbor. Like everybody is upset and wanting retaliation for the latest thing.
So my brother, I'm bringing my brother. Like
Okay.
that's yeah, that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah. So this is the kind of thing. Now, Fujita's plane is an awkward float equipped Zero that cruises around only maybe 90 miles an hour, which is incredibly slow because before this, I Googled how fast do you think like an F-16 goes?
At least 600 miles an hour.
1,353 miles per hour. So that feels like a massive difference. That makes me really think that maybe the 90 miles an hour is wrong. But either way, an incredible
Mm,
difference. Crawling versus jet engine is what it feels like. So
I
Fujita's
don't think you're
plane,
terribly off though. Like I'm sure well, first of all, this is World War II, so we
yep.
don't have F-16s to compete with. And secondly, if you have the capability of being submerged or at least sit on the water like that, you're probably giving up in other areas.
Oh yeah, that
So
pontoon is
crawling
going
at
to have some wind
90s,
resistance.
that kind of makes sense, I would think.
Okay. So since he's at this disadvantage with the slow plane, the turtle of a plane, he doesn't decide, but the higher ups themselves, they decide that, as cool as it would be to bomb the major cities, what we could do is we could have you fly over this heavily forested area in the Pacific Northwest and drop a couple of bombs. And this is going to kick off a series of forest fires, might even wipe out a couple towns. But it's going to divert a crap ton of resources from the battle and the war effort. And it's going to strike fear into the hearts of the Americans as they're dealing with,
Problems.
yeah, like bad day bears or bad news bears. And so this makes a ton of sense to all the power players involved. And then like as I was reading through this, I was like, but this is Oregon. This is the land of what is that giant orange thing in the sky? And I'm thinking during this time period, if we're talking September, it's already started raining again. Like we get beautiful summers, but then you turn off the summer switch and the sprinklers from the sky start again. Well, it was raining, and so these are the things. But Fujita drops a total of 4 bombs on the town of Brookings, Oregon, over the course of a few days. Now, there is a forest server.
I don't know
What?
why that's so funny to me. I'm so sorry.
No, like elaborate. What part is the funny bit?
Like the idea in its bare essentials is clever. Like
Yeah.
let's start a massive wildfire and that will divert resources and manpower and all the things, right? Like that makes sense. But you have to imagine that Fujita himself is hopping onto his plane like those sons of this isn't gonna work. Like just shaking his head looking at the weather, looking at the situation and being like, this is the worst Tuesday of my life.
Well, but I think from what I've read, it was a dry day, the days he did this. Now,
Oh, okay.
was
So
the
he's not like
ground
looking at
dry?
the thunder clouds coming
Yeah.
in.
Yeah, he's not
Okay.
watching the misters, mist. Because honestly, it missed in this area. It feels like you're a
Right.
vegetable in the grocery aisle from
Yeah.
September to June. But there's a Forest Service lookout. His name is Howard Raz Gardner, and I don't know how we get the nickname Raz, but he hears what he describes as a Model A Ford that backfires, and then he catches a glimpse of a super small plane. So he does the responsible thing. He calls the ranger station to report it. And the operator, he assumes it's one of the many patrol planes that are just passing up and down the coast. So we don't need to worry about it. Now, later, the fog lifts and Gardner sees smoke and he sounds the alarm for help. Now, he assumes the smoke is from a lightning strike. Maybe there was, they had an electrical storm the day before, and this probably related to that. And Gardner and a coworker, they go to the epicenter of this blast and they see that there's fires covering 50 to 75 feet across. So it's
Okay.
bigger than you want it, but two people, two humans get it under control fairly quickly.
I love that for you.
What Angie loves is that I did gestured too, which looked like a peace sign, which looked like a party, and Zoom decided to kick off a ton of balloons. So I have that going for me. Um,
One of these
either
days she'll turn it off and I will be so devastated.
I refuse to because levity is always needed.
Thank you.
Now, they find a crater at the absolute epicenter of this. It's 3 feet in diameter and just 1 foot deep. And at the center of it, they see signs of intense heat, including fused earth and rock that resemble lava. So things were hot.
Okay.
And it seems that Fujita had dropped these bombs right after it stopped raining and the forest was wet. So the bombs create just enough smoke for the Forest Service to see, but it couldn't get very far.
Uh,
Now, a later report says, quote, the bomb in falling had struck a fir tree about 6 inches in diameter, much as though lightning had struck it. The fin of the bomb had sheared off a tan oak tree 5 inches in diameter as cleanly as though it had been done with a heavy and sharp axe. Fragments of the bomb had been scattered around over 100-foot radius, one of the blazing pieces lodging in a decayed stump, setting it afire. Okay.
okay.
So they find these fragments and some metal casings. They find some thermite pellets because it was a thermite bomb. And they conclude that the bomb had caused damage, but they assume it must have been accidentally dropped by an American plane. Because remember, we got those patrol planes going up and down the coast. They still have no clue that this was an actual attack.
Okay.
This is like the bully coming up to you on the playground, slamming a punch into your gut, and you just not knowing, like being looking the other way, eating a sandwich, just eyes into the distance.
Minding your business.
Yeah. And having them just kind of go, oh, dang, oops.
Sorry.
Now, the next day, there's some searchers out and they find the bomb nose cone and there's a casing fragment with Japanese markings. And so, yeah, maybe it wasn't an American plane now that dropped that because reasons. So they gather
I
up all of
mean,
these pieces. Go ahead.
no, I was just saying because reasons. Yeah.
Yeah. So they take about 60 pounds of evidence and they bring it to an army lieutenant in charge of the Gold Beach detachment. Now, now that we have this, now there's rumors of bombings that are buzzing all over town, right? Government officials, they're trying so hard to keep this under wraps, but this ends up getting national headlines.
Of
The
course.
I mean, because right, like somebody says something and suddenly it's like, oh my gosh, this is our worst fears. There's a version of the story on the State of Oregon website that says if the forest had been as dry as normal, the plan would have worked, leaving forest fires that diverted hundreds of firefighters and large amounts of money from the war effort, and it would have triggered catastrophic levels of panic.
Okay.
But since it's
So he
national,
just went on the wrong day,
yeah, I mean, like,
a month earlier.
right. And this could have just been beautiful. Now, because it's national headlines and you can't get it out of the news because it's already there, the State Defense Council, they decide to actually do something smart about it. They use this attack as propaganda. State Coordinator Gerald Owen puts it bluntly and says morale among civilian defense workers was getting low because many of them believed it can't happen here. Well, it did last Wednesday. So the workers can see just how or what they're working for. We've been praying for such an attack to shake people out of their lethargy.
Like, this is the thing we were shooting for?
Well, it was more like, if you're so detached from the war effort, you're not paying attention. You're just like, oh, yeah, everybody's having a tough go. It doesn't change my Tuesday. I still have to crank out
Go to
orders and make
work.
phone calls and do data entry. And then for this to be
Right.
like, no, this is a big deal. And it happened in my backyard.
Right.
So
That
this is
makes
what
sense. Yeah.
what it is. I mean, it sounds very cold, but if this is your job is to promote the war effort, then you've got to spend what you get.
Yeah.
Now, despite the level of energy around this attack, this was one that I hadn't heard of, and I hadn't read about the what happened when Fujita's sub after they bombed. Like none of this happened to me. But after he drops the bombs, he returns west on his way home. He ends up sinking his ship sinks two naval tankers off the Oregon coast near Coos Bay and Gold Beach. Again, I hadn't heard any of this story. I heard it when my kiddo's piano teacher dropped this knowledge on me because his parents live or grandparents lived in Brookings, Oregon.
At the time.
Not I don't or I don't know if it was at the time, but for him it was like, "Oh yeah, this is just family lore."
Common knowledge. Yeah. It's just
Yeah,
something we talked about at dinner.
right. And then like, having had the video go viral on TikTok, like everybody in the area was like, "Well, of course, I thought everybody knew that. How did you know?" I was like, "Do you know about the missions in California?" No, let me tell you. I can tell you about the Miwok, the people that, like,
Yeah, this isn't common knowledge for everybody.
yeah, you know it because it's in your backyard. But if you lived in New York, you know nothing. You know nothing,
You
Jon
lived.
Snow.
Oh, Jon Snow.
I know,
I
you're
don't
still not
want
over it.
it.
So
I'll never be.
we're going to fast forward. We're going to fast forward to 1962. The town of Brookings, they're gearing up for the town's Azalea Festival, which sounds delightful. And after what I can only imagine are some beers, the Junior Chamber of Commerce came up with the idea of inviting Fujita as a gesture of goodwill to the man who attempted to wipe their town off the map.
Um, how many years later was this?
So what? 62 versus
Oh, I don't. If you said
42?
62, I totally didn't hear that. Okay, 20 years.
All
Got it.
good. Yeah. Now, obviously, not everybody appreciates this idea because this is only 20 years after, and up to 50% of the men in town fought in that war. And so
We have thoughts.
they're not exactly thrilled because the war was only 16 years ago when it ended. There's some thoughts and feelings, right? And more than 100 residents of what I can only assume is a small town, they end up making a petition to block Vegeta from getting involved.
Hmm.
Now, an article by the OPB, they talk about how these arguments were in coffee shops all over town, and that the president of the Junior Chamber of Commerce received a death threat about this invitation that he was gearing up to extend.
Oh my.
And I mean, I hear this and my brain says, this checks.
America.
We have
Yeah.
not changed.
America.
Yeah. Now,
Stick to what you're good at, I guess.
we're consistent, right?
If anything, yeah. You
Yeah,
got to
like
give us that.
so despite the death threat, he goes ahead with his plans to invite Fujita, and they're traveling from the Ibaraki prefecture, and it's Noburo, his wife, I know this, Akeo, and their son. Yasuyoshi, and they're staying at, and I love that I have this detail, the McChesney's home for the first day in Brookings. Because again,
I
this is
love
like a
this.
very small town, right? You're not going to put them up at the Marriott.
Did you even have a Marriott?
I bet not, right?
Yeah.
Now, I mean, because Brookings, I didn't check this, but they might have a Starbucks. It doesn't seem very big. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I have a friend that lived there until very recently. She only lived there for a few years, but she said it was very, very small.
So this checks.
Yeah, and is still, and that was just, I mean, they just left the area like last year. So,
So Fujita, when he got the invitation, he says part of him felt that he's going to be pelted with like rotten eggs, or he could even be tried as war crimes because he recognizes that he dropped bombs on American soil and he gets this invite and he's thinking it's rather sus. But even
I mean,
still, yeah, I mean, it,
he's
I
not wrong to think that.
I wouldn't put it past us.
Honestly, we know us.
Yeah, this checks. So he still ends up bringing his family. You know, he has his wife, his son, and he ends up bringing his family's 400-year-old samurai sword with them. Now, Fujita took this sword on every flight, including the bombing missions that he took over Brookings. And I found that very interesting because that's not something that I necessarily knew that occurred, that you would take your family sword into battle even now, like it was fascinating. And without knowing what to expect, Fujita planned on the possibility of using the sword to commit seppuku if things look like they're going sideways. He wanted to be in charge of his own entry point.
You know? Good for him, I
I
guess.
mean, it's a different society, it's a different way of thinking. If it's a foregone conclusion, at least take control of the things you've got.
I don't disagree with that. In this particular situation, if you have no other, you know what I mean? Like
Well,
that is your culture, that is your society. Why would you
yeah,
not want the honor?
right. And I think that's really what it is like you can dishonor your family or you can take the honorable route.
Yeah.
As foreign as it is to me, that's the patterning. Now, with all this going on, there's a few men, including some Forest Service employees, who had first spotted the smoke that was from the bombs. They're jailed preemptively by the authorities to avoid any altercations, which feels like a civil rights
Come
violation.
on, Dave.
Yeah,
Just for the day.
Raz, you got that name with the two Z's for being a menace. Get in get in the clink.
The wife told me you were here. Come on.
Yep. There's a couple of teenagers who fly a Japanese flag from the high school flagpole, and that's allegedly pulled down like just moments before the Fujitas drove by.
No.
And I'm just like,
Okay.
this seems like a high school thing. You know what I mean? Like this checks. So the Vegetas get there, they're ultimately welcomed, and Nobuto presents the sword as a gift to the city as an act of contrition. And
Mm.
he responds, I didn't know if I know the significance of it. Would I be able to give something that had been so important to my family away? And that is reported by Brenda Jacks, who's the retired reference librarian. And that sword is still on permanent display at the Chetco Community Public Library.
I think that's fantastic.
I think it's just beautiful, right? Now, an hour outside of town, it's not, you don't see the charred forest. You don't even see the crater. There's just a single coastal redwood that was symbolically planted at near the end of Nobuo Fujita's life. And a lifelong resident, Greg Jacks, the one who's married to Brenda, the retired reference librarian, he remembers how Fujita continued to foster his bond with the town. And he says, I just can't admire the man enough, he says, just to keep his friendship between the town and himself. He was so good about that. Fujita, at one point in building a relationship with the citizens of Brookings, he had promised to bring a group of high school students to Japan for a cultural exchange. But then his company goes bankrupt. And so it takes him years to be able to fulfill that promise. but he ends up
Mm.
going through and making it a reality because he said he was going to do it. So, in the grand scheme, Fujita and his employers donated thousands of dollars for a collection of multicultural children's books that, for the Chetco Community Public Library. And then in 1997, a few days before he died, the town of Brookings made him an honorary citizen. His daughter later came and spread some of his ashes at the bomb site. And
It's so like, I'm sorry,
no,
humanity
go.
is such an interesting thing because he came the first time with such intent, you know? Like,
Yeah.
I'm salty about the things that happen and I want retribution for my people and, whatever the case may be. But I don't know, to grow up and to realize that like we're kind of all in this together.
Yeah.
And that each act he went through was to redeem his own like vision of himself. Kind of brings a little tear to your eye.
I
Carry
mean,
on. Sorry.
no,
I'm a
you're
little
good. I'm
weepy over
literally
here.
almost done. But it's like, I think that's a lot of like growth in general when you look at like the things that make you angry and you can't believe that somebody would wrong you like that. And then you unpack it enough with therapists. You do a lot of your own healing and growing, and you recognize, oh, this happened for that reason, or this person was going through that. And while what I went through was not excusable, it's understandable,
Hmm.
and everybody in war is going for retaliation and triggering more retaliation.
Yep. But in this particular scenario, not only was something beautiful to come of it, he got to see it in his own lifetime.
Yeah,
It wasn't like, we don't get to hear this heartbreaking story where the town forgives his daughter, but he actually got to witness like the love of these people in
right.
one way or another, and I think that's really cool.
It is fascinating and it is lovely because we don't get that often.
No, I would have to agree with you. Not nearly enough
Yeah. But even with
at
that, so
all.
the only last line in my notes is according to Brenda Jacks, the daughter said that part of Fujita's soul is forever flying over Mount Emily where the ashes are,
Hmm.
which is just lovely. And I think I know you've seen this because, you and I are friends and TikTok does what TikTok does. But when the video went viral, somebody duetted me. And as I'm telling the story of this, they're walking through a parking lot and they're walking into a building that is fairly nondescript to me because I don't know the area. And it ends up being a library. And they walk through the library to the case with the sword. And it was just so incredible to see and to realize that the internet is that connected
Hmm.
and I should know better. I should know the internet is that connected, but it was just lovely and it was so fascinating to have that opportunity to engage with that.
The internet has done, I mean, always there's negative that comes out of things, but the internet, I think, has done some really beautiful things with humanity and people's willingness to reach out and make cool art and connect in ways that we wouldn't have been able to otherwise. Like, yeah, I think
Yeah,
there's a reason that's a viral video. Yeah,
but that is the story of the time the Japanese bombed Oregon during World War II.
that is definitely a pre-palate cleanser to my story.
Oh, should I have saved mine? Do I need to re-edit this whole episode?
No, people just listen to it in reverse and we'll be fine. I mean, mine could end on some interesting thoughts.
Typically, when you
And
say you're going dark, it's a light shade of gray at best. When I say I'm going dark, it could be Terrare, which is awful but lighthearted, or it could be mind-blowingly Teresa, I need to go cry in the shower.
well, you tell me what shade of gray I reached when we get to the end. Um, I'm gonna bury the lead for just a second. I'm gonna give you my sources in just a second. Hopefully, I can get this out in our allotted time. I thought it would be fun or interesting to go outside of my norm, which, as you say, is barely a shade of gray. But deep down, I am actually a sucker for Victorian Gothic vibes. Shocked world. I know. Just take a step
Are
back.
are you going to tell us about and read us excerpts of Victorian porn?
No, no, I'm sorry. Is that what you were hoping for?
No, because when
This
I got to
is,
the part where they talked about separating like see moving the fur around to actually see the things, it was I'm out.
it's not that 50 Shades of Grey we're doing today.
Yeah, I'm not going to yuck anyone's yum, but that was not for
50,
me.
50 Shades of Victoria, we're not doing that today.
No, please and thanks.
Um,
That's a
no,
different
no,
podcast.
it is. I thought that it would be interesting to go over Jack the Ripper.
Oh,
Um, this is something that has intrigued my brain for as long as I can remember. The story on the whole, it's really well known, right? Like, I'm not bringing you stuff you don't already know. But I'm hoping that you haven't heard all the theories yet as to who it could have been.
I mean, I feel at various points in my life, I would be able to recall them with astonishing accuracy. I'm not at that
Okay.
point, but I probably
Oh,
will pull
fantastic.
either a compilation of the theories as one and tell you one conflated theory, or,
Okay.
you know,
All right. Well, I'm excited. I thought this would be a really fun. Fun is not the right word to use here.
no, I mean, I hear you.
Intriguing.
Yes,
You know?
walk you down the neuro pathways and make your brain tingle.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
exactly. So I thought I would start by briefly going over the details and then discuss the individuals that have been previously presented, or at least some of them. And then lastly, I wanted to tell you one of the more recent suspects, why it works, and why I don't think it's personally right either. So with that said, allow me to get you to my sources. And I'm so sorry, there's like 13 of them. JackTheRipper.org, the Texas State University School of Justice, as well as the Center for Geospatial Intelligence and Investigation. They teamed up to give us a pretty good idea and understanding of the Ripper's movements, which I think is pretty phenomenal when you think about how that was, like 150 years ago, and we have the technology today to digitally replicate some of the steps that were taken.
Yeah.
So I think that's pretty interesting. The BBC, there's a science.org article, does new genetic analysis finally reveal the identity? The FBI's website, which I was like, okay, that's actually pretty cool. We've got the FBI.gov. An A&E article on victims of the Jack the Ripper theory, historytools.org, Casebook. Okay, now Casebook might be the most interesting um source I've ever come across. Casebook has all of the known information from the time. So you can actually go back through and read the inquiries made at the time in the language that it was spoken. Not to say another language, but the language of Victorian England at the time,
Okay.
which is fascinating. And the amount of time I spent just in there out of pure curiosity was probably a little bit too much. Here we go. UK Parliament. Smithsonian has an article on still not being able to confirm the identity of Jack the Ripper. And then the whole reason I started this, there is a TikTok theory that got me pondering about it. And I'll get to that at the end. And then an all that's interesting article as well. So, with all that said, just a brief background. Starting in August of 1888 and continuing over the next few months into November of the same year, at least five, possibly six women would fall prey to a ruthless killer. The area of Whitechapel, located in London, England, was not the vibrant, friendly area that we see today. By then, London was the largest capital city in the world, and not all of it was as lovely and perfect as we see, like in Bridgerton, right? Like it's not the Ton, right?
Right.
Um, we're looking at the area of, specifically of Whitechapel. It's seedy. It's got like 75,000 inhabitants, and they live in extreme poverty. Like the worst kind of poverty. I don't need to go into it. You know what to expect of that kind of,
You're living
you
in a
know.
poorhouse, you're shipping your children off.
Yeah, and also everything's overcrowded. You're dealing with all sorts of immigration because we've got the Irish potato famine also occurring at the same time. We've got Russian and Jewish and many other people escaping for religious persecution reasons, and we also are in the Industrial Revolution. So things are not pretty in this area.
Right.
I'm just going to leave it at that for time's sake. At this time, though, I would like to give the names of the victims. Are you familiar with their stories at all? Like off the top of your head?
Not off the top of my head, which I suppose is healthy.
Probably. Okay, so I'm about to ruin your day. Um, Preemptively, I'm sorry.
You're not. Carry on.
So I am. These women are women that are marginalized. They're often women on the outskirts of proper society. They're working in less than glamorous jobs. Um, I mean, they're the washerwomen,
Mhm.
the women that are doing whatever they can to survive. There is some belief that most of them were not prostitutes, as
Right.
contrary to what we formerly believed. And I kind of have to agree with that because just because you're simply trying to survive does not always mean you're putting a leg out, you know?
And there's a lot of things like, I know um you'll hear a recent shift in language for true crime when they don't refer to them as prostitutes, but sex workers. And
Hmm.
there is a, big shift in trying to destigmatize sex work because often it's, well, they're a high risk person or they have a high risk lifestyle. So we don't need to investigate their crime as fully as if it had happened in the ritzy part of town. But in trying to destigmatize and humanize these victims, we're able to give them a bit of their humanity back and actually care and maybe do a little bit of the actual legwork
Hmm.
that needs to be done.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate to me that we couldn't have done that for these women and specifically this area. Um, and and what's interesting without going too deep into it, other police forces around the world at the time had the same thoughts. Like you're not putting enough boots on the ground. You're not investigating this the way that needs to be investigated. I don't know if it excuses the Metro Police, but they were dealing with, I mean, just such an influx of immigration and building projects and overcrowding. They didn't have enough resources to do what needed to be done. But does that excuse the fact that these crimes weren't committed in London proper? They weren't committed on well-lit streets. They weren't committed in neighborhoods that would have had better vigilance. Um, no, we could have put more boots on the ground in the neighborhoods that needed it as opposed to the
Right.
neighborhoods that didn't. But, I guess it is what it is, and we kind of see that a lot.
Even today.
So, yeah, yeah, even today. It's odd that that's still a thing, but here we go. All the victims that we know for sure, the canonical victims were in their 40s. They're living in abject poverty, mostly in the streets. With the exception of the last known victim, she was only in her 20s and she actually had a room of her own. However, the first victim was Mary Ann Nichols. She was born called what her nickname was Polly. She was born in 1845 to a poor but respectable locksmith. She grows up, she marries, she has 5 children. It's a troubled marriage. She leaves in 1880. She begins work as a domestic servant and a charwoman, which I didn't know how to look up, but the basic gist
Doesn't that
is
mean
a
they clean out
charwoman.
the fireplaces?
I thought so. That's what I thought it meant. But what I learned with looking at the UK Parliament's labor of the time, it was basically like a part-time housekeeper or like a cleaner for a building. Like maybe she would have cleaned
Oh, that
like
makes
the
more
newspaper
sense.
building.
Okay, because cleaning out the fireplace while laborious might only take a fairly short amount of time.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting to say the least, and she's not the only woman that worked as a char room woman. So anyway, it's said she may have turned to sex work for survival if it was needed. There's belief that on the night of her death, she was seen soliciting. That fact is now argued, and I would have to say that that's probably more accurate. I'm not seeing all these women as being in that field. And even if they were, it doesn't matter. They're
Right.
still women
It's
trying
still
to
murder.
survive, and it's still murder, and it should never have happened. They should have been better protected, and it is what it is.
Right.
The night of her death, she was found throat slit, abdomen slashed brutally.
Right.
That was 8/21 of 88. Annie Chapman, she was also born in 1841. She was the second. She also comes from a working class family. She also has a troubled marriage. She has three children, and while she leaves the marriage, she actually takes her children with her, which I thought was interesting, as opposed to the first lady, because the first lady just left all five and the husband.
Mm,
Second victim took her children with her, which I think adds more to her um struggle. She's not just trying to feed herself, she's trying to feed her three kids as well,
right.
right? Not to say that Marianne was not struggling at all. I'm just saying like it adds we get a little bit more humanity and a little more look at what their life was like in
Right. I mean,
Annie,
because
you know?
I think you and I are moms, right? So we're thinking if we were on our own with our babies, what would we do to take care of them? And the answer is anything we had to.
Yeah, I think what wouldn't we do is it just yeah, it's kind of heartbreaking. It's more than kind of heartbreaking. It is heartbreaking. Unfortunately, she not only dealt with bad health, I mean, gee, I wonder why. Raw sewage is in the streets and it's glum, it's
And she doesn't
gross,
have
it's
access to great
smoggy.
vitamins, and the sunlight isn't freely available. And
Yeah,
yeah,
she's also dealing with alcoholism. When she's discovered,
I
it's
don't
in the
know,
backyard.
dealing with probably using it as a coping mechanism.
Yeah, alcoholism is kind of a coping mechanism for many of the victims, if not all of them. It wasn't specifically mentioned with Marianne, but it doesn't mean that it still wasn't around. It seems to be the one thing that you could afford to have, which is always the case and always unfortunate. Anyway, she's discovered in the backyard of a lodging house, the same as victim number one, throat slit, abdomen torn up. Now, what's interesting is both Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Edos were found on the night of 9/30. I find the fact that they were found on the same evening really interesting because the first two were found 2 weeks apart.
Right.
These two were found on the same night. Elizabeth was born in Sweden in 1843. She immigrated to London in the early 1860s, was a domestic servant before meeting and marrying her husband, John Stride. She meets and marries him in 1869, at which point they run a coffee shop. Things are looking great. But they too would separate after the shop failed, and she would spend the rest of her life in and out of lodging and in trouble with the law for things like public drunkenness and disorderly conduct. She could have been seen soliciting customers on the night of her death as well. Unclear. Her body was found in a dark alley like the other two, except her abdomen was left alone. This begs a question, which I will get to in a moment.
Right.
Catherine Edos, she's from a large family. She has a very hard childhood. She loses both of her parents to sickness before she's a teenager. She finds work and marries a pensioner who also happened to be a street hawker, which I thought was kind of a fun,
What's a street
like,
hawker? Is that like a pawn shop but open air
I
in a
think
cart?
like a street hawker is like like for lack of a better way to say it, hot dog, come get your hot dog. Like
Okay. So a street vendor.
Yeah, like that's what I'm imagining. They have three children, but eventually they have a troubled marriage as well. Gee, I wonder why. She is significantly, from what I can understand, she's significantly younger than him. The way I understand it, if you are a pensioner, you've worked your service. So I'm picturing him at least 20 years her senior. But I could be wrong. That's just my imagination of it. She leaves him and the kids, like the first victim, Marianne. She would struggle also with alcoholism and extreme poverty. She's going from one lodge to the next.
Mm,
The night of her murder, she had been arrested for being drunk and falling asleep on the Adgate High Street. She was released and seen with a man by three gentlemen leaving the Imperial Club. One of them was able to confirm it was her when he was shown a piece of her clothing. Unfortunately, none of the men ever saw her face, but they were able to identify her body based on the clothing.
mm.
As in, that is the woman we saw last night when we left the club. What's interesting about her is she was found in the Mite Square. This is the only murder to take place in the main city of London itself. Throat cut, and her abdomen is horrendously mutilated. So my question is this. Is it possible that she wasn't intended to be a victim, but she happened to walk in on Elizabeth's murder? Because Elizabeth's body is left alone, just her throat slit, but her body is torn to bits.
Well, but okay, so I would assume they're not both in the same location, right? They're in different spots.
They are less than a mile apart.
Okay, but less than a mile is still a mile away. Or,
Yes,
you know what I mean?
within a
It's
mile.
yeah, like okay, so imagine this. You walk in, you uncover a horrific scene, and then what happens? You're taken to a secondary location and then you're attacked. Like what happened in between that? Why was nobody screaming during that? Why did nobody clock that? And if that was already a private location where the first person was offed, you have just one more victim. You would dispatch that victim there. You wouldn't march them almost a mile away.
Unless you were following them. She was headed that way to begin with.
Okay, you just uncover a body and then you decide to take a stroll, like there has to be some
I'm,
reporting thing in between those
you
locations.
would think, but she had just left the drunk tank.
So she's
So
sober and she knows where the cop facility is.
I wouldn't go back, would you?
Yes.
I mean, I guess I'd go back if I had witnessed a murder, but I'm just saying like
Like,
cooperation with the police in this area is not high.
okay, but I would assume there would be some reasons to believe the authorities, even if you're already on the outs with them. And I would
I
assume
would hope.
catching a body would be one of them.
You would th I would hope. I guess that's what I'll say. That was just my curious question. Why was there two on one night?
I would assume
And
more of he didn't get the satisfaction from the one. Like there was something different about that. It may be that he thought he was going to get caught and so he didn't, or the payoff it didn't fulfill the fantasy he had about the act. Like something different happened. And
maybe, I mean,
so,
it is her body wasn't mutilated like everyone else's. So
right. Or it could be that we've just falsely attributed her to the count.
that that is actually a running belief that this was her death was the act of someone else and it just happened to be so similar
Right.
to others that could be the case. Either way, she is considered one of his victims by ripperologists and those that study this particular set of circumstances.
I believe more in the term ripperologist than UFOologist.
So do I, if we're being honest.
Right.
Yeah, at least we have materials to work with.
Yeah.
Lastly, Mary Jane Kelly, she was discovered on November the 9th. She was born in 1863. She is 20 years younger, roughly, than the other victims. She's an Irish immigrant who moved to London in the early 1880s. At the time, she worked as a high class. sex worker in the West End before falling on hard times, at which point she moved to Whitechapel. According to historian Haley Rubenhold, Mary Jane was the only woman who could actually afford a room of her own. In fact, it's believed that she insisted another gal stay with her during the murders in hopes to keep them both safe.
And
However,
that's
she
super
was,
sad.
yeah, she was alone the night of her murder, though. Um, throat slashed, almost completely disemboweled. Now, her case is interesting in that she was a known associate to a man named Joseph Barnett, and they were known to argue a lot and split up and come back and split up and come back. I'm not solid on him being a suspect. There's some speculation that perhaps she had a lady lover, and perhaps the lady lover was jilted in some way, and maybe it's a love thing. It doesn't seem that way to me.
Right.
What I do think is interesting, though, is that unlike the first three, sh her murder took place a full month after, as opposed to 2 weeks. So I was like, interesting.
Well, but
Additionally,
that could happen for a lot of reasons, right? You look at like Joseph
mhm,
D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer, and we had previously been under the impression that I'm some scholar. I'm just gonna float out here right now that I'm a nobody that knows nothing. Um, but like
I
you
think you know
either
lots of things.
die or you go to prison, but there's a reason you stop. And you would assume, but he stops and he has like a normal life. And you're like,
Hmm.
how? How do you not just carry on your merry way? Like, thank you for stopping, but quoi? And
Why?
yeah, and it was just life got too complicated.
Yeah, I mean, there's any number of reasons. Did they leave town for a little bit? Were they otherwise engaged? Was there another victim we just never found? I'm sure that that could have very easily happened. I mean, we hear stories about like the bodies washing up out of the time and things like that. So is it possible there are
Yeah.
more that we don't know about? Yeah, super possible. Who knows? There's so many questions, and I think that's why this story is so, for lack of a better word, endearing to people today,
Well,
because we can't not have answers.
yeah, and we don't have the answers. We don't have any forensic evidence that we can do anything with. So all we can do is speculate. It's the perfect case study.
It really is. And one of the things that I thought was interesting about it is at the time, I'm just going, this is not in my notes, but um at the time when they were compiling their list of suspects, this particular story took hold specifically of the imagination of women at the time, which I always find fascinating that of the true crime aficionados, it's always
It's
women.
always been a thing because you talked about the culottes, or the women, the sans
Hmm.
culottes, and
Hmm.
love of true crime has been around as long as people have, as long as we have offed each other, because there's always well, why did it happen? What can we learn about it? What do we know? Like,
Hmm.
it's a morbid fascination seemingly based out of a survival attempt.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. And even then, the women were just taken by it, like eating up newspaper articles about it. And I just think that's interesting. Um, Historically, as I had said before, the victims all appeared to be sex workers, and how I had mentioned that as of 2019, that's not the firm belief anymore. It
Right.
could have just been that they likely were women trying to survive homelessness, whether they engaged in extracurricular assignments or not is really irrelevant, to be honest, as far
Right.
as I'm concerned. And I think most people would feel that way today. Murder is murder, and it shouldn't be a thing. Now, I do wish to say that at this time, the investigation into the Whitechapel murders was hindered in like every possible way. There were people from the Metro Police, Scotland Yard, and still not enough manpower to cover the ground. As we had mentioned before, there's a lot of criticism from other outlets, like I had mentioned before, from the news, from other police stations. There's just the big thoughts, big thoughts. And additionally, as we have kind of alluded to, the Metro Police are up against residents of the area who don't want to talk to if they know anything anyways.
Hmm.
Because one of the interesting things to come out of this is that through all of the victims, no one reported hearing anything happen. All of the victims were found in similar positions, and none of them appeared to be struggling. Like they weren't fighting for their lives. So I would think you're also up against people who don't want to talk to the police if they do, if they know anything. And there's a strong lack of forensic evidence that was either never collected or lost or ruined in the chaos of the investigations,
Well, yeah, because this
which
is
is
during the
like,
time of like, hey, there's been a murder. Invite the reporters to walk through the crime scene before we tape it off.
yeah. And so, like, we didn't do great. Like, whew, there's a lot. But without further ado, according to Casebook, did you know that there are at least 500 suspects that have been brought forward over the years?
Not surprised. I mean, I wouldn't have pulled that number out of the hat, but you literally could have said any number greater than 12, and I would have been like, sure.
I thought the number was going to be between 50 and 100 because we've had 157 years to think about it, you know?
Well, but you look at anytime you have a big crime and you get like a crime hotline, it was like, I think it was my neighbor. It's my ex-husband. You should look into him. The mailman's a creep.
Yeah.
He should be investigated.
Yeah. Okay, so with that said, some of these suspects range from Prince Albert himself to the author of Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll, to Jewish immigrants. I'm only going to give you a couple of them because,
We don't have time for all.
right, I mean, holy cow, we'd be here for 5 days. The first suspect, and this was brand new information to me, and I feel like I've watched and listened and read a ton of stuff on the Whitechapel murders and Jack the Ripper as a whole for like most of my conscious life. So the fact that I didn't remember this or didn't know this was just wild to me. But the first suspect was this shadowy, creepy fellow who wore a leather apron and was known to threaten the ladies of the area with violence and then often robbing them. Like the women were actually screaming to the police, get that man. He's the Ripper. Like, get him, get the leather apron. He's your guy. But the police were like, we missed him.
Yeah. Who?
Exactly. So this is problematic on a number of reasons. One, they just never caught him. And his crimes, his threats, and his robberies were all committed or started being committed or started being reported long before the Whitechapel murders, and
So we
nothing ever really
see
comes of
we
it.
see escalation if he is the Ripper.
Right. Um, the only thing that actually comes out of this is some good old anti-Semitism because, of course,
Ah, this is going to be the Jews thing on the wall.
there's many Jews things in relation to this. I'll come back to that later, but
Okay.
in this case, it was the apron he was wearing often in this particular neighborhood. Um, People of Jewish descent were engaged in jobs like butchering or um, slaughterhouse positions that would require you to wear the thick leather apron. So just based on that, like you can't be an Irish immigrant that wears a leather apron. Heavens no, you've got to be Jewish. Like people just automatically, that's where they went.
Yeah, that's the logical leap. Okay.
Right, which drives me nuts. The one I find really intriguing is Jill the Ripper, not Jack.
Okay. Go on.
No one could ever really confirm this, but there was a theory that perhaps this whole time they'd been looking for the wrong gender. One witness said she knew for sure that she had seen a victim around the area after her murder at least twice, based on her shawl. Could the real perpetrator have been a woman easily escaping from one crime to the next simply because they weren't looking? Um, a theory from the time, even a midwife, because that profession would have answered all the questions. Why is she out in the middle of the night? Why is she visiting a lone woman? Why is she covered in blood? Like all of these things. Also, a midwife would have the skill set
This
to
we talk about skill
commit the
set,
crimes.
but we're talking about not I don't I know the theory that they had that Jack the Ripper had some kind of medical training, but we're talking about not clean cuts, right? We're talking about some
Brutal.
severe mutilation.
Yeah, I'm saying a skill set as in like tools, which I guess could be in the very basic of a butcher knife. I
I
mean,
mean, you say that, and
a
the
kitchen
joke in
knife.
me, because I do hang out with some different people that are fun. Um, one woman, I was volunteering at kiddo school, and one woman just in her vest pulls out a screwdriver to deal with something. And I was like, "Did you have that in your jean vest to go to a child's school?" And she laughed and she goes, "I'm a lesbian." And then
Of
said,
course.
she's like, "Well, I mean, you go," she's like, "At my kiddo's birthday, like we needed something, and there were like 12 pocket knives that came out of people. Like obviously not
But
out,
not a
like they weren't using
single.
them,
Yeah.
but it was just like, oh, I've got this. And so I don't know, like I feel like knives are more common than we want to believe.
I in my world they are so common it's ridiculous. I'm just spitballing their theories from the time
Okay.
and theories that have been relevant throughout the time frame. These questions were asked at the time by some of the inspectors. Like, could it have been? I mean, we weren't looking for a woman, and a midwife would have had the excuse to be out at night. Is that possible?
You know, I only gave birth once, and while I found it very messy, I don't recall my midwife looking like she had escaped the setup for Dexter's kill rooms, like to
I
film them. You know
also
what I
agree
mean?
with you. I also agree with you on that. And I think that calling her a midwife is a bit of a um knock on a very respected profession. But we don't know.
Sure.
At the end of the day, we just don't know. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle himself, though, did believe that Jack the Ripper was disguised himself as a woman in order to avoid capture,
Sir
as
Arthur
well as
Conan
appearing
Doyle
more
had a
accessible.
couple of other really bizarre theories in life. Like look at his spiritualism practices and things like that. So,
I thought the
the,
same
the man's
thing.
not infallible.
Like, were you asking the Oracle when you came to that? But here we are. He had his reasons were simply because he thought it would make another woman, quote unquote, more accessible to the victims. Like
Now,
you'd more likely trust another woman.
there's something to be said with that. But I think that theory should be extrapolated. Like if nobody heard or saw things and people would have reported to the police had they, then the victim obviously trusted the murderer.
That's there's something to be said for that. Yeah, given that there's no sign of struggle, no screaming, no nothing to be reported, I think that they definitely trusted whoever
Did they
the
trust or
individual
did
was.
they assume that the threat of violence wouldn't be as bad if they didn't fight back? You know what I mean?
Yeah, at the end, I think they had some knowledge of their killer.
Yeah, but you assume I'm
Yeah,
just going to do this. I don't want to kill you. I just want to steal your wallet. Okay, well, I'll let you steal my wallet. And then it escalates. But you don't have,
yeah.
just because you don't see a sign of fight back, it just means that the killer was able to use other means to restrain, even if it was only mentally.
I'm curious, and the husband brought this up while we were talking about this yesterday. I'm curious if they were drugged in some way,
Or we've already said that they had a penchant for drinking.
right?
You
I
get
mean, you could be
somebody,
knockout drunk.
right,
Hmm.
half a bottle of whiskey in, and I'm fairly pliable.
I'm probably going to agree with whatever you're saying, if I'm being honest. Like, now, very interestingly, as of 2019, there's a group of forensic scientists that are saying it was a man by the name of Aaron Kosmzinski, who was a 23-year-old Polish barber, due to some DNA evidence found on the shawl. Okay, so fast forward a little bit.
Okay, now
At
I've
the
got
time of the
questions.
article, as you should, at the time of the article, they were not subjecting the findings to others, thus limiting the confirmation needed. Their statement is that there was DNA of Catherine Edos and DNA of Kominski, Kos Kosminski on this shawl that
But
was able, after 157 years,
sure.
not to say that we can't do DNA testing, but able to confirm belong to someone of their mitochondrial DNA
Okay.
157 years later.
But now show me the chain of or the what is it called? The chain of evidence? Is it there's something like
Yeah.
that where you know that this didn't come into contact with only but these people and this was how chain of custody for the evidence, something like that. I'll remember
Yeah,
it
there's no
an hour from
providence
now.
to determine the
Exactly.
shawl's origins for starters.
Well, and let's assume we
Uh,
know 100% it's hers. But do we know that this broski picked it up, handed it to the police and said, "I think this is from your chick"? Like we don't, you know what I mean?
so the scientists at the time claimed that his DNA came from a sperm sample that was left on the shawl.
Okay.
I still think that because they've refused to release their testing and their results to other labs to come to their own like independent determination of it, that it's BS.
It's
That's
sus.
just my opinion.
Yeah.
It's totally sus. Like if you thought you genuinely believed you had these answers to solve a crime that's been bothering people for this many decades, why would you not want to share that information? Like it's just so sus from the beginning. Another another theory, and I had to share this one with you, and you'll know why in a second, is a gentleman named Jacob Levy, who was a butcher. He died in 1891 in an insane asylum from general paralysis brought on by syphilis.
That's the reason that, ladies and gentlemen, here you were
I
waiting for
had
the
a real
syphilis tie-in.
excuse. There it
There it
is.
is. You know, I
I
couldn't bring it into the
literally,
bombing, but here we are.
here we are. When I saw that, I was like, well, I have to add this. There's no way I cannot add this because I actually have an excuse to say it. Like, here it is. However, all those theories aside, I recently watched a TikTok that I really wanted to share with you a few months ago, but I knew it would lead me to this week that I've had. The creator, her name is Kiki Shire, if I'm pronouncing that right, Schirr, Sheer, maybe.
I think, yeah, maybe
Anyway,
that second choice. Anyhow,
she's concocted a really interesting set of thoughts. She supposes that Jack the Ripper was the French Impressionist artist Edward Degas.
okay.
Okay. So these are her beliefs. This is from her set of research. Initially, she said she basically started looking into this in 2020 when the world was shut down and we were all bored to death. And she just, every question she had kept being answered with coincidental evidence that just seemed too crazy to not be applicable. So by the time the Whitechapel murders had been, they were in motion, Degas would have been 50. And at this point, he is absolutely hating women. He's atrocious to them. Many of his artist friends had pretty much abandoned him because he was growing more and more awful and more hateful as he aged. He
I've met
lived in
people like that.
Paris, right? And there are reasons. I'm going to get to what they suggest could have been the reason for this, but he lived in Paris. However, he often spent time with the London-based artist Whistler, like the
Okay,
Whistler from
Whistler's
Whistler's
mother,
Mother. Okay.
the yeah.
Hmm. Okay. So her theories started with the question of what was his alibi? Did he even have one? Well, He kind of does, but even that's a bit sketchy. Basically, he said he was in the south of France for two of the murders, but he wrote more letters at the time of his visit to people he rarely spoke of or talked about or talked to, along with very, very cheeky, um, witty correspondence to people like society column writers. He's proclaiming loudly what plays he's going to, where he's been, what beach he's on, where he's having dinner. And this all seems sus because most of the people he's writing with are people he hasn't talked to ever. And he sends more letters in those 2 months than he had in the 5 years surrounding it.
So he's fabricating an alibi, is the theory.
Exactly. That's what she's running with. Additionally, he could have been taking the train back and forth to London whenever he felt like it. I mean, they know that's how he went to visit Whistler all the time. So is it possible that he concocts this delightful alibi, convinces this hotel in the south of France to mail these letters out when he asks, but he's really spending his evenings in the Whitechapel neighborhood of London? Who
That's a
knows?
lot of
Interesting
work, though.
idea.
I mean, very
Yeah,
interesting, but yeah.
I think it's very a lot for. I feel like if this were the facts and this were the case, I think the murders would have been different. I don't think they would have been the way we found them.
Yeah.
However, let me continue with my further evidence. Um, on the night that two of the women were taken off the census, some of the anti-Semitic graffiti shows up on the wall. Now, her statement is that the graffiti says, for those that listeners that are unfamiliar, the Jews are the men who will not be blamed for nothing. Jews is spelled wrong. It's spelled Juwes. Some believe this could have been a French spelling mistake, as in French at the time it would have been spelled Juifs. Clearly, the statement itself doesn't appear to be of an English speaker's origin, and Degas is widely known for his thoughts on Jews. I'm not so
But
sure I buy that. I think it's a kind of
the simplest explanation is there's a lot of anti-Semitic thoughts in that area, worldwide, but in that area, and there's murders happening.
hmm.
They don't have to be related.
No, they don't. And that's kind of where my mind was going as well. They don't even have to come from someone who spoke French. Like any number of immigrant just learning English could have put that sentence together.
Or any number
Or an
of
Englishman just changing the way
illiterate,
he speaks.
yeah,
Yeah.
or super drunk and going, it's good enough.
Yes. And then goes back to see his handiwork the next day and is like, "Oh my God, I'm an idiot."
I can't believe that's the wrong there. I did that again. Jeez.
Charles, you were supposed to tell me. How am I going to be held accountable? She goes on to state that his subject of ballerina, as we all know, like that's Degas' bread and butter, beautiful ballerinas, right? Um, is not terribly different than the Ripper's choice of victims. She believes that the ribbons around his neck, around the ballerina's necks, may be similar to the slash marks of the Ripper's victims.
It's a
I'm
long
not sure
shot.
that I go with that. However, I will say this. Upon reading that, I did go look at some paintings and I'm very familiar with his paintings. I've always thought they were beautiful, but on glance now, I'm like, "Oh, they are a little bit dark. They are a little bit does that mean he's the Ripper or does that simply mean mentally he's going to a darker place? Who knows? Unclear. But and here's the part that super gets me. Some of the victims were missing organs after their murders, and they have x-rayed Degas' sculptures to find organic material inside. So there is some belief that perhaps he was stealing the organs to put in his sculptures. I'm unclear. I don't know if I buy it. I think it's disgusting.
I mean, there are some or not hoity-toity, but there are some hippy dippies who will use their menstrual effluent in their art.
Mm,
So, and
you do
organic,
you, I guess.
are we talking like ground up flower petals, or are we talking like we could run some DNA off of this?
I'm unclear. I think we should try to open one up and find out, but I think that's probably a crime against art history. I don't buy it, and this is why I don't buy Degas. According to the National Library of Medicine, and this she states this, Kiki states this in her TikTok, it's believed that he suffered from a blinding condition called Stargardt disease, which basically ruins and blurs one's vision until it's gone. That being said, I am doubting that it was him because the alleys that these women were found in were lit with a single gas lamp that really only put light out about 6 feet. And if your vision is blurry, if your vision is sus, and you're already on in these incredibly dark alleyways, do you trust yourself to commit these crimes? Do you think you could even make it to the neck? Like, I don't buy it. I do think that his disease and his condition is the cause of his kind of animosity towards people in general. Because oftentimes we meet, especially among the creatives like that, we meet them in a mentally unhealthy place with a
Mm.
lot of anger and a lot of resentment, right? That's not unheard of. So I kind of I dismiss Degas wholly, but I think it's a really interesting theory. That said, there is another artist, Walter Snickard, who author Patricia Cromwell accused in her book in 2002 called The Portrait of a Killer.
I
Some of
read that
her
one years ago,
evidence,
but anyhow, go on.
okay, some of her evidence is DNA from letters that were written by both the artist and the killer at the time. She states that per scientific analysis of the paper that was used in three of Snickard's letters and two letters supposedly from the Ripper that were mocking like towards the police and their investigation, that paper, all of that paper came from the same small batch run of paper. Now,
See, I'm here for
it is
that. Give me that evidence, not we believe
right,
there's organic material in a painting.
a sculpture, but yes, I totally agree with you. And I think there's organic material in a lot of art, to be honest. Like if you think about some of the stuff we've seen in our art history classes, yeah, there's probably some blood in there.
There's a lot of
Um,
spit in the food you make for your family because you taste it, you used it, you know what I mean? You double
hmm
dip the spoon. Anyhow,
There's all kinds of things, right? Now, I think it is worth noting that Snickert knew Whistler and was his apprentice starting in 1882. He would have known Degas at the time. So whether it was Degas or not, I don't think it was. But I think that their sphere of influence, their sphere of comrades is wild. And Snickert's work, if you ever get a chance to look at it, is dark and is not becoming of the women he paints. And the situations they're in are, in my opinion, some of his work is really, really intense. Do I think it was him? My money's more on him than on anybody else. And I think it's funny that it comes from a novel. I don't think Patricia Cromwell was too far off. And I think the fact that she's got scientific analysis, not just for the sake of her book, but like, hey, this exists. Like, give me that. That's interesting. Cool. So that's my super dark Angie. That's dark Angie, Jack the Ripper.
that
I'm
was
telling.
darker than I
I
thought you'd
hope I did
go.
not. Sorry.
I'm Why are you
What shade?
apologizing?
What shade?
I mean, it was definitely darker than I thought. But still not necessarily a huge bummer to leave on. More of the, oh, I'm gonna mull this over.
Yeah. And I will say that that's the darkest you will probably ever get from me because my mental health relies on the silly unhinged of the world.
More of the Noburo Fajitas.
The Noboru Fujitas and the automatons and fellas that are willing to put cannons up in their front yard.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, I'm here for
you know?
that.
That's where my unhinged is. But I think that Jack the Ripper is such a long-lasting story, and I think it always will be because we as humanity simply cannot not have an answer.
Yeah.
Will we ever find it? Will we ever be able to confirm it? Who knows? I think it's something that we'll always be interested in. And even if somebody finds irrefutable proof, I think there will still be people that argue it.
Yeah. There's all, yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, because why not? We don't know. We can't go back and ask.
I mean, look at any big assassination, any large event. There's a website that birds aren't real. Let's be honest.
Oh, it's my favorite. I love that guy.
I know. So if you're wondering, what the heck are they going to bring? Is Theresa going to bring out the darkness? Is Theresa going to tell the history of birds aren't real? Is Angie going to tell a follow-up to Terrare of things that are so delightfully unhinged that it makes everybody question whether or not she's taken her medication or should be on additional medications? Then rate, review, subscribe, and share this with your favorite person who may or may not wear a leather apron to work. And on that note,
Ah,
goodbye.
bye. That's a joke.